When he told me my position was being eliminated, I noticed the way his hands were folded on the desk, perfectly still, deliberately composed. His voice carried that practiced corporate cadence, the kind that's been workshopped in executive training sessions on how to deliver bad news without liability. He spoke about restructuring, market conditions, and strategic realignment, words that sounded important but meant nothing. I sat there nodding occasionally, aware that every second of this conversation had been choreographed long before. I walked through the door. What struck me most wasn't the termination itself. It was the timing. We were 3 weeks away from closing a $3.2 billion merger, the largest deal in the company's history. And suddenly my role, central to due diligence and compliance, oversight, was no longer necessary. The explanation felt too clean, too final, and far too convenient. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out with my security badge still warm in my pocket. But as the elevator descended, something colder than shock settled in my chest. This wasn't about efficiency. This was about removing someone who knew too much at exactly the wrong time. The days that followed, I couldn't stop replaying the details. I pulled up old emails, combed through meeting notes, and cross-referenced timelines with an attention I'd never needed before. Patterns emerged that I'd been too trusting to see in real time. My termination hadn't been a reaction to performance or budget cuts. It had been timed with surgical precision to coincide with the final stages of merger negotiations. I had been the one responsible for verifying financial disclosures, ensuring regulatory compliance, and flagging operational risks. And I had flagged plenty. There were inconsistencies in revenue projections, compliance gaps that hadn't been addressed, and strategic vulnerabilities that leadership had dismissed as minor. At the time, I assumed they'd be resolved before closing. Now, I understood they were never meant to be. My removal wasn't about what I had done. It was about what I knew. I had become a liability not because I was incompetent, but because I was competent enough to see what they needed hidden. The realization didn't arrive as anger. It came as clarity, cold and undeniable, the kind that reshapes everything. You thought you understood about loyalty and trust. They hadn't just fired me. They had tried to silence me. That clarity brought a choice I wasn't prepared for. I could walk away, accept the severance, and let the merger proceed without interference. It was the safe option, the rational one. No legal risk, no career damage, no public conflict. I could move on, find another role, and chalk this up to corporate politics. But every time I considered that path, something heavier pushed back. This wasn't just about me anymore. Investors were about to commit billions based on projections I knew were misleading. Employees at both companies were making life decisions based on promises that rested on unstable ground, and the people responsible were betting on my silence, counting on the assumption that I valued self-preservation more than accountability. The fear was real. I imagined retaliation, legal battles, the quiet ways powerful institutions destroy reputations. I thought about the isolation of standing alone against people with resources and influence I couldn't match. At night, doubt whispered that maybe I was wrong, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe the gaps I'd seen weren't as significant as I believed. But in the morning, when I reviewed the documents again, the evidence didn't change, and neither did the weight of knowing that doing nothing would haunt me far longer than any consequence of speaking up. So I stopped debating and started preparing. I approached it the way I'd approach any high-stakes project, methodically, without emotion, with an attention to detail that left no room for error. I gathered every email, every financial report, every memo that touched the merger. I documented timelines, cross-referenced claims with verifiable data, and identified discrepancies that couldn't be explained away as clerical errors. I reached out quietly to former colleagues who had raised similar concerns, people who had also been sidelined or reassigned at convenient moments. Their accounts corroborated what I already suspected. This wasn't isolated negligence. It was coordinated concealment. I consulted legal advisors who confirmed that what I had wasn't just damaging, it was actionable. They helped me understand the regulatory frameworks, the disclosure requirements, and the proper channels for raising concerns without exposing myself to defamation claims. Every step was calculated. I wasn't building a case for revenge. I was building a case for truth. The process was exhausting, isolating, and at times demoralizing. There were moments when the sheer scale of what I was up against felt suffocating. But with each piece of evidence I verified, with each conversation that validated my judgment, something shifted. I was no longer the person who had been fired. I was the person who had chosen to act. When I finally released the information, I didn't go to the press or post it on social media. I sent it directly to the regulatory bodies overseeing the merger, and to a select group of institutional investors whose due diligence teams I knew would take it seriously. The response was immediate. Audits were triggered. Independent reviews were ordered. Leadership, which had been so confident in their narrative, suddenly found themselves answering questions they hadn't prepared for. The merger timeline, once on track for a seamless close, began to fracture. Investor calls turned tense. Board meetings stretched into emergency sessions. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a strange sense of calm. There was no dramatic confrontation, no courtroom showdown, no moment where I stood across from him and explained what I'd done. There didn't need to be. The truth, once exposed to the right people, did the work itself. The carefully constructed story that had justified my removal, that had smoothed over the inconsistencies and sold the vision of a flawless integration, began to collapse under scrutiny, and I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Silence protects the powerful only as long as it's maintained. The moment it breaks, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. 3 months later, the merger was officially terminated. Leadership faced regulatory investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and the kind of reputational damage that doesn't heal quickly. Some were forced to resign, others remained, but under terms that stripped them of the authority they'd once wielded. Without question, I didn't celebrate. The victory, if you could call it that, came with costs I hadn't fully anticipated. I spent months under stress, burned professional bridges, and made enemies in circles where reputation matters more than competence. There were moments when I questioned whether it had been worth it, whether the personal toll justified the outcome. But then I thought about the investors who had been spared from a disastrous decision, the employees who hadn't been swept into a failing integration, and the standard that had been set. That silence, even when incentivized, isn't inevitable. New opportunities emerged, not from the people I'd worked with before, but from those who had watched from the outside and respected what it took to act. My career didn't end, it pivoted. And in that pivot, I found something I hadn't expected, a kind of peace that comes not from avoiding conflict, but from knowing you didn't look away when it mattered. Looking back, the lesson isn't about revenge or corporate warfare. It's about recognizing the moments when your silence becomes complicity, when walking away isn't neutrality but endorsement. Most of us will face a version of this, maybe not a billion-dollar merger, but a moment where doing the right thing conflicts with self-preservation, where truth and convenience pull in opposite directions. The system rewards silence because silence is predictable, manageable, and safe for those in power. But your knowledge, your integrity, and your willingness to act carry more weight than you think. Not because you're invincible, but because those who depend on your silence are more fragile than they appear. The courage to expose what's wrong doesn't guarantee a clean outcome. It guarantees that you won't spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you'd spoken up. And sometimes that difference between regret and resolve is the only victory that matters. One person with the right information at the right time, with the courage to act, can shift outcomes for thousands. That's not power, that's responsibility. And it's yours the moment you choose not to look away.